All right, guys, I am back and my voice is back. Yeah, it's good to be back. So, I wanted to say this for a long time now. Let's grab a blanket, turn off your lights for true scary my best friend horror stories. Yes.
My artist friend. I might have to delete this. So, this story happened to me when I was 15 years old. I was a super lonely kid. My home life was in shambles. Mom was cheating on dad and told me about it. And I just started at a new high school the year prior, where I didn't know anyone. Creating art quickly became my biggest coping mechanism. To this day, I still love to draw. I discovered the website DeviantArt around this time and started submitting my drawings every day. Through this, I made some friends online of all ages. Some very talented people giving me feedback, positive feedback for my work. And this really inspired me. In my deep depression, I felt like DA was a safe haven of like-minded people who appreciated one another. For the first time in a long time, I belonged somewhere. I spent many hours talking to some regulars on the site. Even now, 10 years later, a few of them are still in my life and I cherish their friendship. But this story is about someone who I never want to meet ever again. DeviantArt also allows writers to submit their stories and poetry to the site. One day, I was on the front page and a poem caught my eye. It was more of an angry rant, full of weird twisted imagery and anti-Christian subtext. Sounds stupid, I know, but it was actually quite well written and funny, at least to my 15-year-old self. Being a very angry, depressed high schooler, I was drawn in and decided to check this artist out. Not only was he a prolific writer, with maybe 100 poems and stories on his site, but this man was a very talented visual artist as well. He created amazing illustrations of weird, funny creatures. Some of them were a little sexual, like naked women, but most of them were humorous or gross. His name was Tom. The combination of Tom's writing and visual art skills intrigued me. Even though he was 30 years old, I decided to send him a private message. We bonded. Soon, we began to talk on AIM. I would look forward to talk to Tom every day, and came straight home after school to connect with him. Chatting for 5 hours was a daily thing for us. In hindsight, my family probably wondered what I was doing, but never said anything. Anyways, isolating myself in my room wasn't abnormal at this point. I was so grateful for my artistic friend. I could be as dark and confident as I wanted when we talk. I unloaded a lot of my pain onto him, and he told me about his troubles too. Tom even started to write poetry about me, happy poetry. It made me feel very special, because I had softened this angry dude's heart with my friendship, or so I thought. He was reliable, always online whenever I came home. After maybe 3 weeks of talking, Tom asked me for my phone number, because he wanted to hear my voice. I was extremely uncomfortable and reluctant. He insisted. He gave me his number to call. Fearing I would lose a friend who was so important to me, I finally gave in. I should mention that I am 23 years old now, and I'm still a very shy person. But at 15, I was painfully awkward and detested phone calls. My heart was racing and I was shaky and sweaty as the phone rang. Tom picked up. Hello. My voice sounded shaky. Tom spoke. I knew his age, but to my relief, he sounded like a teenage boy. This made me feel less uncomfortable, but still weirded out. I had no idea what to talk about, and for some reason I felt like crying. Tom and I spoke for a bit. He laughed at the awkward things I said, so I guess the conversation went all right. Honestly, I cannot remember what we talked about. All I remember is that he barely spoke at all. We got off the phone and talked online some more. He said how happy he was to hear my voice. I was still pretty upset, but glad that I didn't disappoint him. I hoped he wouldn't ask to call me again, because it was such a stressful experience. But I had poured so much time into talking to this man that I was willing to be uncomfortable to preserve our friendship. My self-esteem was non-existent. The next day, Tom wanted to call again. On the phone, I could hear him breathing heavily. He was masturbating. I talked about my day at school, some random thoughts. He stayed silent apart from the breathing. Then when I was mid-sentence, he hung up on me. When I asked him what happened over AIM, he told me I wasn't talking about anything sexy, something along those lines. I apologized and felt a total sense of failure. The conversation then turned sexual. I told him that I was a virgin. In reality, I hadn't even had a real first kiss. Tom was overjoyed by this. Now I really had his attention. At this point, it was May. Our relationship progressed to the point that I let him jerk off to my voice, and even sent him some pictures of me in my underwear when he asked. I had no idea what I was doing, but felt like I had to obey him or he wouldn't be my friend. He started to write poetry about taking a girl's virginity. To his fans on DeviantArt, they were just fictional poems about a fictional girl, but I knew they were really for me. This both thrilled me and made me queasy. My 16th birthday was coming up in June. Tom and I constantly talked about how badly we wanted to see each other. In the back of my mind, I really missed the days before everything got so sexual. I told him there was no way I could ever fly to Florida where he lived. Tom insisted on seeing me before my 16th birthday. Eventually, we picked a date. He found a hotel near my family's house that was relatively affordable, and even bought tickets to fly out. The plan was that I would skip school that day and spend the day with him so he could take my virginity. I can't remember if he was even going to stay more than one day, to be honest. Before he said our goodnights, Tom wrote, "Will you let me get your ass too?" Not a question. A statement. I came home from school one day, and Mom was extremely solemn. She told me she knows about Tom. Apparently, I remained signed in on AOL, but I think she actually got my password to see what I was up to. I began to cry and defended Tom at first, but then I admitted I was terrified of him. I was so ashamed that my mom saw our sexual conversations. But she hugged me and told me he won't be coming, I promise. She emailed Tom, which really friggin' spooked him. Tom began to yell at me and blow up my phone. He told me he spent $500 on the plane tickets that he couldn't get back. I never picked up any of his calls. He wrote me tons of emails in all caps. He wrote angry, violent poetry on DA on how I betrayed him. I was devastated and hated myself. On the day Tom was supposed to come visit, I stayed at my best friend's house, which was miles away in a totally different community. My mom gave our apartment building a photo of Tom to make sure nobody let him in. I was totally paranoid that he would pop up for a while after that, but he never did. In fact, I didn't hear from him at all. He stopped submitting any art or poetry. Over a month went by, and Tom was still MIA. My family and I went to Canada for a music festival. Life was slowly going back to normal, and my guilt was fading. Suddenly, in our hotel room, my phone rang. It was Tom. I tried to pick up, but I can't remember why, but for some reason, since you were in Canada, I couldn't talk to him. I think it's because I had an American service provider or something. In any event, he left me messages. My memory of this is very foggy. He may have been actually texting me. I can't remember at all. A few days later, we took a train back to the US, and as soon as we crossed the border, I sent him a text. I apologized for what happened and explained that I was in Canada, but that I missed him and hope he could forgive me. Tom told me the reason he was gone for so long. He said that on the day he was supposed to come see me, he got very drunk and tried to kill himself. He stabbed himself all over, including his stomach, left hand, and legs. Feeling last-minute regret, he called his mother and she called the police. He told me that his whole apartment was considered a biohazard from all the blood, and after he recovered, he spent time in the psych ward. Tom had mutilated himself so badly that the hospital had to amputate his leg and he lost 2 fingers. He told me this was all my fault. I was utterly speechless and my blood ran cold. I refused to believe him, but lo and behold, he uploaded some pictures of himself on DeviantArt. His leg was amputated above the knee, and he was missing fingers. I had seen previous photos of him. This was my friend, all right. It's hard to explain how I feel about this situation. I feel very sad for Tom, but I also understand that this wasn't my fault. I was a very lonely child and desperate for a friend. And Tom was a schizophrenic man and a pedophile, as was later revealed by his explicit poetry about little girls. Eventually, he was banned from DeviantArt, and I never talked to him again after age 16. A few years ago, I looked him up and found his profile on a different site. Admittedly, I was Googling him to see if he was still alive. In his profile picture, he was next to a young woman with his hand over her mouth. It looked like he found someone who was willing to visit him after all. So Tom, I hope you're okay, but please, let's not ever meet. P.S. If I take this story down, it's because I'm afraid. I was almost lunch for vampires. A few years ago, I was on an IRC network and, to make a long story short, broke up with a couple friends who got together and decided that they were vampires. This was before Twilight was a thing, mind. They started to go off the deep end of the spectrum and started asking how much they could get the more traditional powers of the undead. Form change, blood-sucking, flight, snazzy dress sense, and apparently fell into a group that persuaded them that they had to drink the blood of an unwilling victim. Guess who was a bit upset that they lost their best friends to Boris Karloff and was stupid enough to vent at them? So yep, they drove from the East Coast to the Midwest to perform the final steps needed to turn themselves into ravening, blood-feasting creatures of the night. Fortunately, they didn't check my itinerary, as I was out of town for a couple nights. More fortunately for them, my shotgun-wielding next-door neighbor told them to skedaddle before he introduced them to his favorite toy. Imagine my surprise when he told me that I had unexpected Ray-Ban wearing guests on my front porch, and that they were both carrying, I kid you not, swords out in broad daylight so they could carve me up like a Thanksgiving turkey. I thought they were joking, except one of them mailed me once they got back to the Atlantic that I lucked out due to intervention of opposing forces. Anyways, this was well over a decade ago, but still creeped me the hell out that they'd even try this. Old friend isn't so friendly anymore. I first met my friend Nick in middle school. At the time, we weren't really friends, but I did get to know him a little bit. Frankly, he scared me when I first met him. He was one of those kids who wore all black, gave himself piercings during class using safety pins, etc. He was bipolar and a whole slew of other issues, including being on drugs at the time too. Fast forward a few years to high school. I didn't really have any friends and was kind of a loner. I also have a fall birthday, so I was one of the first kids in my class to turn 16 and get my license and start driving myself to school. Nick had grown out of the goth, druggy phase, got on medication for his psychological problems, and seemed like a fairly normal guy now. One day, he was talking to me and asked if I could give him a ride home. I was happy to, since at the time I was desperate for someone to hang out with. I ended up being very good friends with him, and another guy he hung out with, and the three of us pretty much spent all of high school as a group. Looking back, they kinda took advantage of me as my family had more money than either of theirs, and I was more than happy to share. I drove them to lunch and paid for it part of the time when they didn't have the money, always had the newest video game systems, and would pay to rent games from Blockbuster, etc. It was never anything major, just a few bucks here and there, and we really did have good times. They were pretty good guys for the most part, but I do feel like that at least part of the reason they became my friends was because of that. Even if that was the case though, it was well worth it for me because they were literally the only bright spot in my otherwise miserable high school experience. Nick could sometimes be an asshole, particularly if you spent more than a day or so with him at a time. I took a week-long trip to the beach with his family, and ended up hanging out with his brother more than him because he drove me insane. There was a particular incident at a go-kart track where he literally was screaming at a 10-year-old kid and trying to pick a fight with the kid's father after the race because he had cut him off on the track. He then got pissed at me for not backing him up when I was too busy trying to crawl in a corner and act like I didn't know him because he was so ridiculous. I was embarrassed, and front or not, I was kinda hoping that the guy would kick his ass because he deserved it. After high school, Nick stayed in our hometown and went to a local community college, while me and the other guy went to the state university a few hours away and were roommates. We would see Nick when we came home on weekends and stuff. After that year, he joined us. Nick struggled and was in and out of school, never really trying that hard. At one point, his girlfriend from high school cheated on him, and he took it pretty hard. They started adjusting his medication, and I don't think they ever quite got it right, because he was never the same again. During this time, I introduced him to my girlfriend's sister. We had actually gone to school with her, my girlfriend a couple years younger, but never really knew her until I started dating her sister. Anyways, they started dating, and at first it was cool. We could double date and stuff like that. I was a little worried because I knew he could be an asshole sometimes, and I was afraid of what would happen if their relationship went badly. Her parents hated him, and I was always trying to defend him as best as I could without making them hate me too. I got engaged to my girlfriend, so I felt like I was always in the middle between my future in-laws and one of my best friends. Eventually they got engaged too, which her parents really hated. They rushed into getting married. I think they'd been together for less than a year at the time, and moved in together while they were still in school. Things went south rather quickly. He started expecting her to support him, quit going to school, said he was going to live on disability for the rest of his life because of his issues, and they pretty much fought constantly. They had only been married for around 4 to 5 months when he started threatening to kill her. He even went as far as to detail the plans he had come up with to do it. Needless to say, she left, and they got divorced after less than a year. This put me in the awkward spot of having to choose between my fiancée and her family, or one of my only friends. I tried to defend him as best as I could, saying things like, "He's not really like that. His medication is still messed up. He doesn't mean it. He won't really do that. But how can you truly stick up for someone who's threatening to murder his wife?" I did the best I could, but ultimately if I wanted to keep my fiancée, I had to lose my friend. Our other friend was supposed to have been my best man, but he refused after what happened with Nick, so I ended up losing both of my friends over the ordeal. Pretty much exactly what I'd been afraid of when they first started dating. The last time I spoke to Nick, he had come into the store I was working at with some people I've never seen before. I said hey and waved, and he immediately flipped me off and walked out the door. So that was pretty much confirmation that our friendship was completely over. I'm not really sure how any of this was my fault, but apparently I was supposed to completely leave a 6-year relationship and break off an engagement because he was a psychopath who threatened to kill her sister and she left him. I really wish this was the end of the story, but it continues. Her sister found someone new, who is an amazing guy and now one of the closest friends I've ever had. He ended up being my new best man, and I have far more in common with him than any of my old friends. He's been like a brother. I graduated, got married, moved home, and started a family. My now wife's sister got remarried to the new guy, and they have a 3-year-old together now. Everyone is happy, and we pretty much forgot Nick. Until the day he came back to town and started working at the local grocery store. My mother-in-law was the first one to see him, and pretty much forbid her daughter from shopping there anymore. She was terrified that he would come after her or her kid if he saw them. They ended up moving to the other side of town shortly afterwards anyways, so that's not a big deal. I wasn't as threatened by him, so I continued to shop there. I assumed, since it had been about 5 years, that he just moved on with his life too. I would see him working at a register or something, and just go to a different one and try to avoid his notice. But other than that, I didn't really go out of my way to avoid him. One day I saw him looking at me and sort of nodded. I didn't speak to him because of the way our last interaction had gone. I was met with the coldest stare I'd ever seen. After that, anytime I was in the store, he was there following me around. It was almost the way a store would have a worker shadow someone they think might be stealing. Whenever I looked up, he was nearby. When I left the store, he would head outside to bring carts in or something, and watch me until I was in the car leaving. The last time I shopped there, I made the mistake of taking my newborn son. He started fussing, so of course I picked him up and tried to calm him down. At this point, Nick walked by and slammed into me, nearly making me drop the baby. He then walked off like nothing had happened. I decided that day it would probably be best if I started shopping at Walmart as much as I hated to. That still wasn't the end of it, unfortunately. A few nights later, I had stayed up late on the computer and realized I forgot to set the trash out to be picked up. It was about 3 a.m. when I went outside to move the cans to the curb. As I walked out the garbage, a large van with blacked out windows suddenly came down the street and just stopped at the end of the driveway. I was a little nervous since it was 3 a.m. and they were clearly not a neighbor, so I took my time filling with the cans, besides the house waiting to see what they were going to do. Eventually, they went slowly down the street and stopped. I put the cans out as fast as I could and went back inside, making sure all the doors were locked. I went to sleep with my gun on the nightstand. Also around this time, my grandmother's house was broken into. Whoever did it knew where everything in her house was, because they didn't rummage through anything. They went straight where her jewelry was and took most of it. Then they went straight to the closet where my grandfather's guns were, and took several of them as well. About a week later, they returned and cleaned out what they hadn't taken the first time. We have no proof, so the cops won't do anything, but we're fairly certain it was Nick. He had been to our house before, and I showed him the guns when we were friends, since whoever broke in knew exactly what they were looking for, and knew exactly where to find it. That pretty much limits the list of suspects. I've seen the van driving around in front of the house late at night several more times since. It's becoming less frequent since I started shopping elsewhere, and thankfully nothing else has happened. I keep my gun nearby at night now, and we've had a security system installed. Since nothing has actually happened, and since we can't prove he was the one who broke into my grandma's, the cops won't do anything. I'm hoping this doesn't escalate again, so creepy, crazy old friend, who is no longer so friendly, let's not meet anymore.